The air smelled like wet clay and diesel fumes. It was somewhere in the late autumn of 1979, and a crew of contract laborers had been moving through tunnels that, according to their paperwork, did not exist. The walls were smooth, polished in a way that made the foreman run his palm flat against the surface and pull it back like he'd touched something wrong. The ceiling rose higher than their helmet lamps could fully illuminate. The floor was machine flat, running a direction that running it didn't match any of the survey maps they'd been handed at the project gate. And then, roughly 400 feet below the high desert floor of northern New Mexico, they found the level. Not a level as in a tool, a level as in a floor. A floor that opened into something that should not have been there. Nobody filed a formal report. Nobody who was there that night talked about it for years. And the federal survey maps were either never updated, or they were scrubbed. Something was built beneath Dulce in 1979 that was deliberately kept off every government survey map in existence. And the story of how we know that is stranger than the structure itself. Dulce, New Mexico sits on the Jicarilla Apache Nation Reservation in Rio Arriba County, pressed up against the Colorado border in a stretch of high desert that feels, even on a clear day, like the edge of something. Arleta Mesa is not just a geological feature. It became the focal point of one of the most persistent and structurally coherent claims in the entire canon of suppressed American history. Beneath it, multiple levels deep, the United States government, in collaboration with entities that were not human, constructed and operated a facility of extraordinary scale and purpose. The project was allegedly initiated in the early 1970s and reached its most critical phase of construction in 1979. It was financed through black budget allocations, never submitted to congressional oversight. It employed workers compartmentalized to such a degree that most of them never understood the full scope of what they were building. And it was erased from every public-facing document, survey record, and geological report. That erasure is not incidental. That erasure is the point. The Dulce underground base hypothesis holds that beneath Archuleta Mesa there are no fewer than 7 distinct subterranean levels, each assigned to specific functions. The upper levels, dedicated to conventional security, laboratory research, and human personnel housing, and the deeper levels, particularly levels 6 and 7, dedicated to biological experimentation. The 1979 date is significant as the year the facility's deepest functional tier reportedly became operational, and in which a violent confrontation, the Dulce Wars, allegedly erupted in the lower levels. Reconstructing what happened in those tunnels in 1979 requires piecing together testimony from multiple sources, none of whom were willing to speak on the record in their own lifetimes. What emerges from that reconstruction is not a single clean narrative, but a composite picture, like a photograph developed from several overlapping negatives. The workers who were brought into the Dulce project did not come through normal federal hiring channels. According to testimony gathered by researcher Paul Benowitz, an Albuquerque-based physicist and electronics contractor, the labor force was recruited through private contractors. These workers signed non-disclosure agreements, phrased not as standard security clearances, but as proprietary business contracts, which meant their silence existed in a legal gray zone far easier to enforce. The workers were transported to the site in vehicles with blacked-out windows. They were told they were working on an underground storage project connected to the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. The physical environment they described was consistent across multiple independent sources in ways that are difficult to explain as pure fabrication. The walls of the lower tunnels were described as having a vitrified surface quality, glassy and dense, consistent with boring technology that uses extreme heat rather than mechanical cutting to displace rock. This technology, known as nuclear subterranean boring, was developed by Los Alamos National Laboratory during the 1970s and is documented in declassified patent literature from that era. Corridors running roughly 20 feet wide and 15 feet high, lighting recessed into the ceiling with no visible fixture housing, just strips of cold white illumination that cast no shadow, and a sound. A low-frequency hum present throughout the lower levels that several workers described as feeling in their chest rather than hearing with their ears. The first time any coherent account of the Dulce facility reached a public audience was through Paul Benowitz's presentations to UFO research audiences in the early 1980s. Those presentations were almost immediately followed by a systematic effort to discredit him. Let's talk about that effort, because it tells us something important. Beginning in approximately 1980, personnel connected to the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, specifically an operative named Richard Doty, began feeding Benowitz a stream of false information. Doty and others provided Benowitz with fabricated documents, encouraged his most extreme interpretations, and systematically drove him toward conclusions that were unprovable while isolating him from credible researchers. By the mid-1980s, Benowitz had suffered what was described by his family and colleagues as a complete psychological breakdown. He was hospitalized. His research files were scattered. His credibility had been so thoroughly demolished that his name became synonymous, for a generation, with paranoid delusion. The conventional explanation holds that Benowitz was a genuine eccentric who stumbled onto classified but entirely conventional Air Force activities near Kirtland and began interpreting them through an extraterrestrial lens. The federal response under this interpretation was not suppression of a real discovery, but damage control around legitimate classified programs that Benowitz was inadvertently stumbling toward. It's a coherent explanation. It accounts for several facts, and it fails on three specific points that the conventional framework cannot absorb without becoming internally contradictory. First, the workers. Benowitz's claims about the physical construction of the Dulce facility came from separate testimony chains that predate his involvement with Doty. Second, the survey maps. Geological survey records for the Archuleta Mesa region in Rio Arriba County contain gaps that do not correspond to any geological justification. Third, the technology. The declassified nuclear subterrane boring patents from Los Alamos describe a system capable of producing precisely the wall characteristics that workers described. The conventional explanation requires us to believe that a technology capable of deep, covert construction at scale was developed, patented, and then never meaningfully deployed. That is not how government technology programs work. Now let's widen the frame, because Dulce is not alone. The pattern of what was allegedly constructed at Dulce appears not as a singular event, but as a member of a class. Researchers have cataloged similar structural signatures at locations including the Wasatch Mountains in Utah, the Cheyenne Mountain Complex in Colorado, and at least 4 sites in the Nevada Test and Training Range. When you see one anomaly, it's an anomaly. When you see 11 anomalies with overlapping structural characteristics, you are looking at a program. The 1979 operational date connects Dulce to a specific historical window: the Carter administration's final year, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the Iranian hostage crisis, a period of extraordinary national security anxiety during which black budget expenditures were determined to have reached levels that could not be fully accounted for even by classified audits. The Church Committee investigations of the mid-1970s had already demonstrated that American intelligence agencies were capable of operating programs of significant scale entirely outside congressional awareness. Why would powerful actors want to suppress the existence of the Dulce facility specifically? The answer operates on 2 levels, one practical, one structural. If the facility's lower levels contained biological programs and non-human presence, disclosure would represent a fundamental challenge to the legitimacy of every federal institution involved. Whoever built what was built beneath Dulce in 1979 was not operating within the law. They were operating beneath it, in every sense of the word. The black budget system, the proprietary contractor framework, the use of intelligence operatives to actively discredit civilian investigators. These are tools that only retain utility if the public remains unaware of them. The Dulce suppression is not primarily about Dulce. It is about maintaining the architecture of deniability itself. That is why Paul Benowitz was not simply ignored. He was destroyed. Because a man who could be dismissed was less dangerous than a methodology that might validate every contract worker who had ever been told to forget what they'd seen. Now here's the piece that skeptics always arrive at, and they're right to arrive at it. Where is the physical evidence? If a facility of the scale described was built beneath Archuleta Mesa, there should be geological surface evidence, subsidence patterns, anomalous seismic readings, thermal signatures detectable from aerial survey. The argument from the Dulce research community is not that no physical evidence exists. The argument is that the mechanism of suppression was sufficiently advanced, that the surface evidence was preemptively managed. The National Geospatial Intelligence Agency maintains classification authority over survey data that touches on national security infrastructure. The question is whether it was applied to the Archuleta Mesa region in a way that was broader than standard procedures would justify. The absence of physical evidence is not a refutation of the hypothesis. The absence of physical evidence is a predicted outcome of the suppression mechanism. That's a circular argument, and we should be honest about the fact that it's a circular argument. But circularity is not the same as falsehood. Sometimes a thing is hidden, and the fact that it's hidden well is the truest thing we can say about it. The Jicarilla Apache Nation, whose land Archuleta Mesa sits on, has its own oral tradition regarding the mesa. Elements of that tradition describe the mesa as a place where the ground speaks. Those accounts predate any contact with the Dulce Base hypothesis. They predate Paul Benowitz. They predate the Cold War. They describe something that sounds functionally identical to what the construction workers of 1979 described. You can dismiss that as coincidence. You can note that infrasound is a natural geological phenomenon, and that the mesa may simply have unusual acoustic properties. But then you have to ask why a mesa with unusual natural acoustic properties was also selected as the site for classified construction activity. You have to ask whether the people who selected it knew about those properties and what they thought those properties indicated. And when you start asking those questions, you realize that the Dulce story is not ultimately a story about underground tunnels. It is a story about who gets to decide what is real, who controls the maps, who classifies the surveys, who selects the contractors and writes the non-disclosure agreements and deploys the operatives and hospitalizes the investigators. That's the real structure here, not the physical structure under the mesa. The institutional structure that makes something like that possible. The very absence of evidence becomes a wall as solid and glassy and machine-smooth as the tunnels those workers described when they finally, years later, found someone willing to listen. Was there a facility beneath Dulce? Was it built in 1979? Were its deepest levels doing what the hypothesis claims? This channel is not going to tell you what to believe. What we're going to tell you is that the evidence for suppression is documented. The technology for construction was real. The workers' testimony is consistent. The survey gaps are real, and the treatment of Paul Benowitz is a matter of public record. What you do with that is your decision. If you have heard testimony from a family member, from a former contractor, from anyone with a connection to classified construction projects in the American Southwest during the late 1970s, we want to know. Not for sensation, for the record. Because the thing about a story that was kept off every map is that the only way it survives is if enough people refuse to stop telling it. What do you think was in Level 7?